Welcome. This is the first in a series of videos where I will introduce and talk about anarchist writers from around the world and across history. I will be beginning with selections from Robert Graham's 3-volume collection, Anarchism, but then go on to other texts as I branch out. My main approach will be what has been called anarchist without adjectives, meaning I'm going to discuss these ideas broadly across the libertarian tradition without focus on certain threads or strategic perspectives, and I hope not to get bogged down in those discussions in the comments or in my videos. My focus is mostly historical and analytical, but to the degree that anarchists will find my commentary on these texts valuable, I will be pleased. In this video, I will talk about Bao Jingyan, a Daoist Chinese thinker who is sometimes called China's first anarchist. Bao Jingyan lived sometime in the 3rd or 4th century, which places his life in the aftermath of the collapse of the Han Empire. So he saw the failure of empire. Much like thinkers in the early medieval Europe, living under the shadow of Rome, 4th century Chinese writers had to tackle the failures of their own imperial system while bearing the burden of living with the remnants of the institutions and ideas of that imperial system. The Han Empire formally fell apart in 220 CE due to a coup by a general named Cao Cao. He dominated the final Han Emperor, and when Cao Cao died in 220, his son formed a new empire called the Wei, essentially dethroning the last of the Han Emperors. But this only ended what was in effect a shattered dynasty. The fall of Luoyang in 190 CE pretty much ended any hopes of an imperial revival. Even Cao Cao, the general, spent most of his time trying to put down rebellions. Intellectually, one of the main outcomes of the fall of the empire was the emergence of new traditions, such as Buddhism, and some older traditions that were neglected or forgotten saw a bit of a revival. The most important of these was Taoism, and for this we need to go back to the early 100 schools of thought. The 100 schools of thought refer to the intellectual movements of the late Zhou period. It saw the origins of Confucianism, of Taoism, and of an authoritarian tradition called legalism, as well as many other traditions that we know not so much about, and some that we know a little bit about. The Han endured partially with an imperial synthetic tradition made up of Confucianism, a few ideas from Confucianism, and other ideas from legalism. Confucianists focused on morality of interpersonal relationships and on the proper order in governance and society. They took for granted the necessity of a ruling order. Legalism, though, was much more brutal. It presented the stick, harsh punishments for violating the order and the demands of rulers, and generous benefits for those who followed it. This was the only way to rule. Together, they formed a powerful ideology for the empire that would rule much of East Asia for 400 years. Legalism reflected in the institutions of law, punishment, benevolence to loyal followers. In Confucianism, the image of a just and moral ruler through ritual and virtue and these kinds of ideas. According to student of Chinese philosophy William de Barry, Confucianists believed, quote, "The most important capacity that a ruler can have is the capacity for recognizing that he must treat the people as he himself would want to be treated in their position. Ritual, which affords an idea, means for ordering one's personal life, also represents their ideal mode of governance, because the rites are the vehicle through which the ruler expressed his own virtue or moral power, and also encouraged a sense of dignity and responsiveness among the people." Legalism, on the other hand, quote, "openly advocated war as a means of strengthening power of the ruler, expanding the state, and making the people strong, disciplined, and submissive. They conceived of a political order in which all old feudal divisions of power would be swept away, and all authority would reside in one central administration headed by an absolute monarch. The state would be ordered by a set of laws that would be administered with complete regularity and impartiality." The Taoists, on the other hand, believed that the best way to govern was not to govern at all. In Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, we get this following bit of wisdom on rule. The more prohibitions there are in the world, the poor are the people. The more sharp weapons the people have, the more disorder is formed in the family and state. The more erudite and clever men are, the more deceptive things are brought forth. The more laws and ordinances are promulgated, the more thieves and robbers there are. Therefore the sage says, I do nothing, and the people are transformed themselves. I value tranquility, and the people become correct by themselves. I take no action, and the people become prosperous by themselves. I have no desires, and the people of themselves become like uncarved wood. And in the same little book, we get this additional piece of statecraft wisdom. Quote, what enables the great rivers and seas to be king over all the valley streams is that they are good at staying below them. And thus can the king over the valley streams. Therefore, if one wants to be above the people, one must, in using words, remain below them. If one wants to be ahead of people, one must, in using one's person, remain behind them. Therefore, when a sage places himself above, the people do not find it a burden when he places himself ahead. The people are not hurt. Therefore, the world finds joy in praising him without wearying of it. And because he contends with no one can contend with him. To some degree, it seems that Lao Tzu is talking about the best way to rule. So his goal in the end of the day is still to rule. But he does think the best way to rule is to do so with a soft hand or not at all. The less a ruler does, the less law, like for instance, the less laws you make, the less crimes you'll have. The revival of Taoism after the decline and fall of the Han Empire makes some sense. Maybe the problem with the Han Empire was that it was ruled too much. To be fair, many Taoists at the time neglected politics altogether, and the period is often talked about as a moment in which the Taoist religion made the shift from being a pure philosophy to being one that was religious. And the Taoist religion was built up, and this religious Taoism would eventually become part of the imperial cult in later Chinese empires. But let us not blame the early Taoists too much. Their structure of local cults and religious experimentation and apocalyptic speculation made sense in the context of the ruin of an empire as great and as long-lasting as the Han. However, as with any religious Taoism had rules and hierarchies and institutions and commandments and eventually bore little resemblance to the original ideas of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. Bao Jingyan was, however, a political Taoist who seemed to know exactly why the Han Empire failed. Now, I can't comment on all of his writing, for all I have is a short passage in an anthology of anarchist writings. But I have enough to give some broad framework of his ideas. So the first thing we can say is that he quickly rejects the Confucianists for believing that order means hierarchy, and that order comes from above. After 4 centuries of emperors claiming that heaven justified their rule, can we blame him for his skepticism? Indeed, all the order was a mixture of domination and submission. In his words, it is because there was submission that the relations of lord and subject arose, and because there was a servitude of the people, being powerless, could be kept under control. Thus, servitude and mastery result from the struggle between the strong and the weak, and the contrast between the cunning and the innocent. And blue heaven has nothing whatsoever to do with it. The second thing we can say about Bao's ideas was that he believed in a natural state of egalitarianism and nonviolence. And much of this brief essay I have here talks really about this natural state of life, of the universe, of Earth, and of human societies. We are tempted to compare it to Enlightenment era state of nature theories. And the comparison may not be that far off. I think it's apt to a degree. For whenever someone tries to explain the origin of government, anyone wants to see government as a historical force, something that emerged out of a process of history, and that has a history, that's not eternal, right? If we assume it doesn't come from God in heaven, we need to posit a time before government. If government is bad, then the time before government must be idyllic, right? Otherwise, what are you comparing the bad that government does to? However, if you believe government's a good or a necessary evil, then you must posit, as Thomas Hobbes did, that the time before government existed must have been horrendous. And it's just a matter of proving it which is, of course, very difficult to do because we don't really have historical records from the times before government. But Bao Jingyan does something very interesting, and he goes to domesticated animals for inspiration. And it seems that this is something that one can contrast domesticated animals to similar animals still living in the wild. And he says, "To be baited and bridled is not in accordance with the nature of the horse. To be put under the yoke and bear burdens does not give pleasure to the ox." Now, in giving up this natural state, he believed we surrendered ourselves to drudgery, violence, and poverty. And after talking about the drudgery of horses and oxen, he says, "And so the people are compelled to labor so that those in office may be nourished, and while their superiors enjoy fat salaries, they are reduced to the direst poverty." The third thing we can say about Bao Jingyan's ideas is that Bao believed that virtue was almost always implied the opposite. Just like the homophobe who protests too much at the suggestion that a celebrity of the same gender is good-looking, a government obsessed with fidelity must be plagued with rebellions. Filial piety, or a father obsessed with filial piety and submission of his children, must be a failed parent. Filial piety is the last resort of failed parentages. Quote, he even says this, "Filial obedience and parental love are only displayed when there is discord among kindred." Fourth, he believed governments were historical. And for me, this might be the most important innovation and contribution of Bao Jingyan's ideas. Now, the idea that governments were historical is certainly not fully denied by imperial tradition. Of course, there were imperial histories and historians, and there were several famous Han-era historians who tasked themselves with writing the history of the Han Dynasty and then previous dynasties as well. You know, one of the great Confucian classics was the Spring and Summer Annals, which is a collection of historical accounts. And there's even a book of history, which has also been lifted up into the pantheon of Confucian texts. However, they believed that governments rose and fell according to the mandate of heaven. And thus they had a much more cyclical view of history. And there's kind of an internal perseverance of the state and power. And yes, governments can lose that mandate of heaven and be overthrown, but they're restored by a just government. So heaven wants government and hierarchy, and the authority of society is a reflection, in states, is a reflection of the authority of heaven over all of us. However, Bao is able to give us a strict materialist historical account of government. Quote, "In earlier times there was neither lord nor subject. Wells were dug for drinking water, and fields were plowed for food. Work began at sunrise and ceased at sunset. Everyone was free and at ease, neither competing with each other nor scheming against each other." Well, then what went wrong? Well, what went wrong was the arrival of the profit motive in many different guises. Now, Bao basically reduces this, at least in the passage I have, to consumer goods and the desire for gems and clothing and that kind of thing. But it all comes down to a desire for wealth and luxury and kind of and rising above others, and getting that through the exploitation of other people in various ways. Essentially, what he ends up coming to is the idea that our beloved emperors are nothing more than glorified bandits, and that their greed-inspired competitors, lowly competitors, is hardly surprising. With the rise of government came bandits and thieves and war, and eventually the laws required to protect these gains. So yeah, it's a very simplistic historical view of government, but it is nevertheless a historical view that sees a period before government and sees a government emerging out of purely materialistic reasons, not the mandate of heaven, not some divine intervention, but merely the greed of a small group of people who managed to claim power. Now, a fifth conclusion we can say about Bao Jingyan's ideas is simply that the state was violent. And to understand this, we need only quote him directly, as he writes directly on this. Quote, Although tyrants such as Qie and Zhou were able to burn men to death, massacre their advisors, make mincemeat of the feudal lords, cut the barons into strips, tear out men's hearts and break their bones, and go to the furthest extremes of tyrannical crime, down to the use of torture by roasting and grilling, however cruel they may by nature have been, and how they could have done such things if they had to remain among the ranks of common people. If they gave way to their cruelty and lust and butchered the whole empire, it was because as rulers they could do as they pleased. As soon as a relationship between lord and subject is established, hearts become daily more filled with evil designs, until the manacled criminals sullenly doing forced labor in the mud and the dust are full of mutinous thoughts. The sovereign trembles with anxious fear in his ancestral temple, and the people simmer with revolt in the midst of their poverty and distress. And to try to stop them revolting by means of rules and regulations, or control them by means of penalty and punishment, is like trying to dam a river in full flood with a handful of earth, and keeping the torrents of water back with one's finger. So again, it also creates the dialectic, doesn't it? That once you have violence by the hands of the leader, this is going to inspire equivalent violence by people resisting this dehumanization. So, in conclusion, the heart of his idea is that kings and emperors are just glorified bandits who trampled on nature for private acquisitions of wealth, and so doing so destroyed nature and human nature and human communities and human solidarity and freedom and relative equality. Now, those who want to dig deeper into Bao Jingyan's ideas can also come to the conclusion that the abuse and misuse of domesticated animals is an offense to nature. He blames inequality on the same forces that bring to the rise of government. Bao Jingyan does not paint a complicated picture at all. He does not need to find fault in human nature or in human society or in other sociological forces. All the evils he describes are rooted in the state. They may not stop there, and certainly they're replicated and copied and emulated by society. But that's where the virus begins. Government, in his words, is little more than, quote, making holes in noses where no holes should be. It is not surprising that Bao Jingyan's ideas were not more broadly received. Chinese politicians spent the next 250 years trying to remake the glory of the Han Empire and to form a new empire. And they eventually do that with the Sui and later on with the Tang empires. Buddhism would spread like wildfire. Religious Taoism would as well, but neither of these were overtly political, even if they sometimes ran into trouble with established imperial thought. Both traditions would be attacked mercilessly by Confucianists. But it's only a few writers like Bao Jingyan who were able to offer up political alternatives to empire. Bao Jingyan even has trouble being taken seriously by scholars. Charles Hucker, in his classic History of Imperial China, says briefly of Bao that, quote, his views were swallowed up in the pure conversation dilettantism of his time, when intellectuals were not inclined to take mundane matters seriously enough even to be anarchists. But if he was the only one, so be it. There would be other Chinese anarchists, even if for those would have to wait into the modern period. Success is the best form of propaganda, and the success of empire in East Asia is hard to deny. From 600 CE until 1911, there is almost an unbroken chain of empire in East Asia, sometimes ruled by the Chinese, often by foreigners, but the shadow of an empire may to this day cloud the discussion of the virtues and sins and evils of the state. If an anarchist tradition exists in China today, it does so in spite of a ruling ideology enamored with empire and progress and state power. So that does it for Bao Jingyan. Thank you so much for listening. In my next video in this series, I'll be looking at Etienne de la Boétie's On Voluntary Servitude, written in 1552. If you have any thoughts or comments on Bao Jingyan, Chinese anarchism, or other early anarchist thinkers, please comment. And also like and subscribe to my channel in order to hear more of my commentary on anarchist thinkers, or to listen to my reviews on American writers.